Shalom, everybody. Welcome for our last class of the series, with which we approach the end of the book of Leviticus. The main subject of our discussion this evening will be the Shmita and the Yovel, the particular laws around the 7th year and the 50th year of the cycle. Right, the sabbatical year and the Jubilee year. I just want to note again that I will be finishing at 7:30. That is in an hour and a half. So you can plan if you can stay that long. And let's get started on our material now. So, Parsha begins, Parashat Behar begins. Speak to the children of Israel, say to them, when you come into the land which I am giving you, v'shavta ha'aretz Shabbat l'Hashem. The land shall rest as a Shabbat to God. So the idea of the land resting as soon as they come into the land. Now there's an irony there. According to the beginning of the Parsha, we hear that this command was given already at Mount Sinai, 40 years before they went into the land. It was given then already, perhaps with the sense that the people would be going imminently, very, very immediately, into the land at that point. But things happened, as you know, and their actual arrival in the land was delayed 40 years. So when the time comes, finally, this command is going to be activated, and it's now conveyed to the people. And we have the irony then of the people having lived an unlanded existence for 40 years. That's the nature of a midbar, of a wilderness. They've been wandering in the wilderness for 40 years, distinctly without land. They're not landed gentry. And the prospect has been that they will go into the land and they will become landed. That is what it means. But the very first thing they're told about that condition is that the land has to rest, a Shabbat to God. In other words, in a way, the land, the ground under your feet will no longer actually be yours. It'll be yours and it won't be yours, as we'll explore, as we go on to explore the implications of that paradox. So this paradox, in a way, accompanies the people, you might say, for 40 years. They're walking through the arid desert, distinctly unlanded, then they're finally going to go into land, and they know, and they've known all along, that the first thing will be, in a way, a Shmita year, that they'll have to face that prospect of what's called the sabbatical year, the Shemita year. When the land will rest, there'll be an experience of land rest. And if the people fail to keep this commandment, the punishment for that will be exile, galut, which is like a long Shabbat. That is, they'll be away from the land. The land will be resting very well. And we want to look into the implications of what that rest is. It's not quite as idyllic as it sounds. Shabbat, we can get a dreamy look in our eyes about Shabbat. I want to demystify Shabbat. I want to try to think somewhere in a very tough way about what Shabbat means when you apply it to the land. It means, in a sense, let it be. Neglect it. It will be neglected. It will be wild. It will be abandoned. It'll go back to nature. As a punishment for those years that you didn't keep in the course of your sojourn in the land. And the exile will last 7 times 70 years. Right? Their history was a history of 7 times 70 years. They lost 70 sabbatical years. They failed to fulfill them, and the punishment will therefore be a 70-year exile. So it's all very neat and mathematical. Every 50 years, after 7 cycles of 7 years, there will be the Jubilee year, and there things will be even more radical. Slaves will be released permanently with no possibility of compromise. Loans without interest to the poor, no interest in general, and then finally, right at the end of the Parsha, one verse against idolatry. Again, in a way, picking up from the beginning of the Parsha, the idea that all this is about God. That all these many laws that seem to be socio-economical in their nature, they have to do with how you will live on the land, how you will deal with your agriculture, how you will deal with your manpower, how you will be a productive country. All those things are not limited simply, for instance, to the value of being good to the poor. In the end and at the beginning, there is a reminder that it's all about God. And at the end, it takes the form of don't worship idols, as if that has something to do with all this material that we've been looking at of how we should and shouldn't behave on the 7th year and in the 50th year. So, with this, I want to go into the first source on your page, which you can see in number 1. It's labeled Torah Tmima. It's actually the Talmud in Kedushin, Daf Chav 20b. And I'll go through it very quickly. I'll paraphrase it partly. Come and see, kama kashe. How terrible, here's the translation here, right? How much pressure is put on you by even what's called the consequences of violating the provisions of the 7th year. Even one of the rules of the 7th year that isn't exactly one of the main rules, it's one of the offshoots. It seems like a minor rule. And what is that? That you're not allowed to do business with the fruits of the 7 years, of the 7th year. Noseh v'noten. A person does that. He indulges in trade, right? He tries to sell and market some of his fruits. That's his original misdoing. But what happens then? Lasof. The next thing that happens, and now we have a list of disasters. It's an avalanche of disasters. I'll go through them very quickly. In the end, he has to sell all his movables, all his movable furniture and so on, things that belong to him. And there is a proof text to support this. And then, if he doesn't feel what he's done, a couple of lines later, if he doesn't realize, if he doesn't think better of what he's done, he doesn't amend his ways, I think your translation gives us, then lo hirgish, in the end he has to sell his fields, not just his movable property, but his actual, real estate, the reality under his foot. And then again there is a proof text, and then another expression for if he doesn't realize what he's done, and he has no opportunity to change his ways, to amend his ways. Lo inal liyad, lo bat liyado. He doesn't have a chance to change until the next stage happens, and he has to sell his house. And then again, he doesn't change his ways until he sells his daughter. So he's really in trouble. He's in serious financial trouble. Things go from bad to worse. It's a slippery slope of misfortunes and tragedies. And then in the end, he has to borrow on interest, as if that's an even worse disaster. He has to actually commit a sin. And then after that, if he still doesn't change his ways, or he won't change his ways, before he has had to sell himself. Never mind his furniture and his land, but himself. And then finally, the final stage is if he still doesn't change his ways, then he is sold to paganism, to idolatry. He's sold into into a pagan home, and then the final stage is not only into a pagan home, but also he is sold as an attendant to idolatrous practices. That he himself will become a professional of idolatrous practices. Now, this is dramatic, not to say melodramatic. I'm saying avalanche of misfortunes. Look what happens. It's the slippery slope. You started by taking one misstep. You traded in the fruits of the 7th year. Right? That was the rather modest beginning. And then things got wildly out of hand. It's the sorcerer's apprentice. It's all these nightmare scenarios of suddenly you find that everything is out of control. And there are two aspects to this being out of control. The obvious aspect is that bad things happen to him. He has to sell and alienate from himself everything that belonged to him. right? Because he played around with the seventh year, with the year of Shabbat, and we want to go into the meaning of that year. Things become extremely serious after that, and stage by stage, he loses himself. He is alienated from himself till in the end he sells himself, and not only to an Israelite, but to a foreigner, and to an idolatrous foreigner, and then finally even to actually the service of idols. Now, this scenario, that's one side of it, that's the obvious side. And we're supposed to think, poor man, how he brought tragedy upon himself. But the other side of it, it turns out, as you look more closely, is that all these stages of misfortune are also sins. It's not just that he is the victim of an avalanche of bad luck, that's all kinds of terrible things, and he goes down, 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 but he is also in some way a soul in free fall. He finds himself committing one sin after another. Selling, for instance, his property at the second stage, selling his lands, selling his fields. Right? That is actually not only a misfortune that he's driven to do that, but it's also a sin. You may not sell your fields, for instance, in order to buy things that you might need, right? To have liquid cash, to liquidize your field, to liquidate your fields, in order to have cash to buy smaller necessities. Now, it's a misfortune if he has to do that, but it's also against the law. It's also in some way yet another breakdown of his identity, of his integrity. He is going against the very laws that should hold him together because of one fall. So he's not just a victim, but he is the protagonist of the story. And I want to put it that way. One could think perhaps that this savors a little of blaming the victim. Not only does he have to suffer various misfortunes, but he's now blamed for everything he does. I don't want to go that way, although I can't help thinking of it. What I want to say is that he's not merely a victim of others, but he is also a protagonist, a moral agent in his own story. And he's a moral agent who does things more and more and more badly. He kind of loses any sense of integrity and coherence. And so we have a strange story in which we have to kind of, the moral focus shifts. We start by being sorry for him as a tragic figure, and then we begin to realize that actually he is not just a victim, and there is a kind of turnaround there of sympathies. We see him now as making choices and as making bad choices all the way down the line as a result of that first misstep. Now, if you look at number 2, there's always a lot more to say about everything, but I'm pressing on. Look at the Gemara Talmud in Kedushin, Chaf Bet, 22. Here we're dealing with a different subject, and this is the subject of the slave who after 7 years has to be released. That's the law. If he refuses to go free, and this is the strange quirk suddenly in the law, that there is a slave who stands his ground and refuses to go free and exercises a kind of freedom, right? He says, Lo etzeh choshi, I'm not going free. Ahavti et Adoni, I love my master. That is, somewhere perhaps a personal relationship has sprung up between him and his master. We want to look further at that. For some reason, he feels motivated to refuse freedom. What should happen in such a case? I remember being horrified by this as a child, reading it in my Chumash on Shabbat. The master takes an awl, a sharp implement, and pierces his earlobe into the doorpost of the house, leaves a mark on his earlobe as a sign somewhere of disgrace. This is not a good thing. The slave has disgraced himself by refusing freedom. Now, that notion, let's read it in the Talmud here in number 2. The question now is, what did his poor ear do that it has to suffer? Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai haya doresh. Ma nishtana ozen. Why is the ear set apart from all other limbs in the body? The ear is suddenly the red-hot part of the body, and that's the one that suffers this marking, this punishment. Why the ear rather than any other part of the body? Good question, of course. But it immediately, I think, makes us think of all the limbs in the body, of the sense, the body sense of a human being. Human being is not just an object who can be seen to have many limbs to his body. He's not just something that other people look at. He is a subject inside his own body in some sense. Inside, outside. It's very hard to exactly imagine this, but we usually say inside. And here he has a whole body full of all kinds of possible sights. Why the ear? Why that sense? The sense of hearing. So God answers, the ear that heard at Mount Sinai. We're going back to Sinai again. At the moment when I said at Mount Sinai, mine are the children of Israel as slaves, they are slaves to me and not slaves to other slaves, that ear then went and acquired a master for himself. That ear was the one, that's what heard my assertion, my commandment, what's the word I want? God is speaking at Mount Sinai, and he says, they're my slaves, and therefore they cannot be slaves to other slaves. And in spite of what he himself heard at the moment of revelation, he went and did acquire a master for himself. That ear should be pierced. So the ear gets pierced for inadequate hearing. He didn't hear well, right? He didn't listen well. Now, the ear gets punished then for acquiring a master in a situation where God said, but I am the only master. Lib ne Israel avadim. In other words, that positive statement, they are mine, precludes their becoming slaves to anyone else. That is the way it should be. They shouldn't have sold themselves as slaves to start with. If they're slaves, it's because in some way of a fallen reality, of the reality of this world, either because they didn't have money, right, that's the social tragic reality, or because they have stolen, they've got themselves into this situation. But now they're refusing the opportunity to go free. You can't argue that it's a free choice not to go free, right? You might want to argue that, but does the Israelite have the right to give up freedom? And the answer is given on religious grounds. No, because God. Because God, yeah. And what has happened now is that this slave has alienated his own identity. It's again that idea. So suddenly, instead of the master being required to be kind and humane to the slave, the poor slave who is the victim of a system of slavery, which is our first reading, suddenly the Talmud turns it around and says, no, that poor slave has made certain choices, and he's certainly making a choice now when he refuses to go free, which contradicts the presence of the divine in the world. Right? It's a contradiction of some kind. But then we might well ask, why was it that commandment that the slave is said to have heard at Mount Sinai? Mine are the children of Israel as slaves, right? That certainly is a verse in our Parsha, but it's not something that was actually said at Sinai. That's the irony of it. Why did the Talmud choose to quote a verse that as being heard at Sinai, which was not heard at Sinai? And they didn't hear the whole Torah at Sinai. They heard the Ten Commandments, if even that in completion. So why this particular command? And so it's interesting to notice that in the Jerusalem Talmud, as opposed to the Babylonian Talmud, the same sage, the same scholar, Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, is quoted as saying something a little different. I didn't put it on your page. Perhaps I should have. It would have been interesting to see it on your page, but I'll try to convey it. The same idea. This ear heard at Sinai. It's singled out because it heard at Sinai a different verse. Lo yeh lecha Elohim acherim. Right? The second commandment. It heard, you shall not have other gods before me. And this ear went and acquired a master for himself. Right? And what does that mean? Perek me'alav ol malchut shamayim. He broke off from himself the yoke of the kingdom of heaven. Yes. And he accepted upon himself the yoke of human beings. He accepted the supreme, he rejected from himself. He broke off, he ruptured a connection with God, which is called accepting the yoke of the kingdom of heaven. It is a discipline, it is a system of some kind that holds him within it. And he accepts a different system, a different cognitive meaning system, which has to do with other human beings. Other human beings are going to make sense of his life. He's going to be trying to please other human beings rather than trying to please God. And that's called acquiring a master for himself. And the ear that could be so treacherous, so deaf to the message of Sinai, right at the beginning of the Ten Commandments, you shall not have other gods, that ear shall be pierced. Now, the idea of accepting the yoke of the kingdom of heaven, that's, of course, an extremely important idea. To accept the yoke of the kingdom of heaven, right, we're already beginning to get a sense of it. It's not just, the emphasis is not on being crushed under a yoke, an animal somehow being burdened by a yoke, but a sense of being connected and in service to something larger. And that larger thing is called God, and everything else is called idolatry, avodah zarah. And then this person went and committed the idolatry of other people. And that's the strange leap that's taken here. And suddenly this person is almost heroically guilty, right, when he refuses to go free. It's really a very serious misunderstanding of what was wanted at Sinai. When he said, I love my master, then he's already taken a wrong step. That in some sense he's saying, perhaps it could be translated this way, I love having a master. I love having a master, even if it means going against God's command, which was, you shall not have an idol which is a master which is an idol. And that's what I want to explore for the next few minutes. To accept the yoke of the kingdom of heaven, I think it's a little enlightening perhaps to think about occasions when we are absolved. We are free of fulfilling that commandment, that ongoing commandment. One is a chatan and kala, a bride and a bridegroom on the wedding night. It's a very interesting notion that the bride and bridegroom on the wedding night don't have to say Shema Yisrael. Quite striking, which is the statement, the avowal of accepting the yoke of the kingdom of heaven. Hashem Elokeinu, Hashem Echad. Why are they absolved? Because they are not free to accept the yoke of the kingdom of heaven. They are impassioned. They are driven at that moment. They're not their own masters. They're not free. And that is, again, a kind of depth plunge. Suddenly we're taken into deep waters. What is the necessary condition for accepting the yoke of the kingdom of heaven? Right. Have a look at the Sfat Emet now, modern, that is 19th century Hasidic passage in number 3 on your page. He begins this passage by saying, it is the quality of a Hasid. What's a Hasid? No, we don't have a translation, right? A Hasid is a pious person who's pious beyond the minimum. That he wants to go beyond the sheer line of law. It's not enough for him simply to fulfill his duty. We talked about this last week, the idea of kedusha, of holiness, as going beyond the minimum of the law and moving into that rather volatile area of aspiration, of being open and ready and attentive to listen for something beyond. The way the Sfat Emet puts it is that such a Hasid is someone who is enthusiastic at all times. He's on fire, mitlahev. At all times, he's sort of constantly on fire to fulfill the commandments of the Creator. That is, he's alert and engaged and aware and looking out for somewhere indications of God in the world. What might God want from me now? He's not satisfied with the clear, concrete things that he knows already, that are written into law. He's looking out for intimations. And that's what it means to accept the yoke of the kingdom of heaven. To be in readiness like that. And that's that state of being with your ear, cocked, I don't know if that's the right expression, with your ear alert to listen for what comes next, is more important than the actual fulfillment of the mitzvah. Now, that's quite a statement. The fulfillment of the mitzvah, important as it is transcended by a state of being, which is called Kedoshim Tihiyu, be holy, or here it's called being a Hasid, and being in a state that precludes then being a slave. You can't do that when you're a slave. And then he goes on to say, quite challengingly, that you might think, it might be possible to think. The slave might say, it really suits me very well. I love my master. I think being a slave is just great. In a way, it gives me a clear structure to my life, and I have a wife given me and children, and I don't have to take responsibility for anything, so I can fulfill all the laws very piously and very dutifully. There's really a lot to say for slavery. And it's easier for me to fulfill the commandments in a state of slavery to an Israelite master. And the Sfat Emet gives him the benefit of the doubt. In some way, he acts as the devil's advocate. It's really a very generous reading. He said, maybe you're not being so wicked if you say that. I really think the state of heteronomy, not to be autonomous, is very good for fulfilling God's laws. And the Sfat Emet says, oh, but you don't begin to understand. That's not the condition of Bnei Yisrael, the Hasid. That is not the condition that we are supposed to be in. That kind of passive, law-abiding condition. That's why when the people commit themselves to the Torah, they say, Na'aseh v'nishma. That's a very, very sweet reading, not at all the classic one, very modern reading. They put Na'aseh, which is just sheer obedience of the law, first, because that is just the minimum. What comes after that is v'nishma, and then we'll go on listening. And that is the description of a Jew. That's the way one is supposed to be. That is midat b'nei Yisrael, as he says at the end there again, to be always listening for the word of God. Now, that kind of elitist attentiveness, exquisite attention, like someone who's very musical, and can tell in some very deep way what his cues are for how to continue with his music, that is almost a description of a neurological state, a body condition, right? How we are in our bodies when we are being Hasidim B'nai Yisrael, attuned to listen for intimations of the divine in the world. What might God want of me at this point? The slave who is so mistaken, so misled as to think slavery is a good state is actually, in a way, just one version of the general Israelite fantasy of returning to Egypt all the way through the desert. That is, there's always this fantasy of wanting to go back to Egypt, to a state of slavery, that it was better there, perhaps even religiously. Right? That's what they want to claim. That even with what we've gained now from Har Sinai, we'd be better off in a state of tameness and slavery. And the Sfat Emet very passionately makes a case against this seductive idea. And so what we have when we see a member of a human being actually in slavery, we are seeing a soul that has lost its true self. If he insists on remaining there and talks about love of the master, he is exercising a phenomenon, a way of being in the world, that since Freud, we call it transference. And I want to move it into that territory. Freud noticed that his patients always fell in love with him. always began to adore him in a quite deluded way. Right? He was elderly, he wasn't that good looking at that point, but they began to idealize him and make of him their God in some way. If you have a look at now on your page, Rashi, the next passage on your page, number 4, you can see the text that I want to attach to this. This is Rashi at the very end of the Parsha. It's the last verse of the Parsha, where the reference to idolatry suddenly emerges. After all the socio-economic laws of Shmita and Yovel, suddenly we have this statement, Lo ta'asu lachem elilim, you shall not make for yourselves idols. And you suddenly think, what has idolatry got to do with everything we've had so far? And here is Rashi, with a classic understanding, but not quite unpredictable. This is about someone who is sold to a non-Jew. Right? He is a slave. Sorry, yes, he is sold to a non-Jew, right? Like the pit into which our first slippery slider ended up. That if someone is sold to a non-Jew, that he shouldn't say, since my master is a libertine. All right, that's the translation here. Migale arayot. Since he is a libertine, since he has loose morals, so I will imitate him. I will be like him. I will just assimilate to that reality. That's what it means to be a slave. I want to please my master, and therefore I will just mold myself around his ways. And similarly, other cardinal sins. Since my master worships idols, that's the one that's relevant here, so I will do also. And since my master profanes Shabbat, so I will do like him. Profaning Shabbat, profaning Shmita, right, it's all part of different kinds of et shabtotai tishmoru, different variants of Shabbat. If you profane those, you are in some way like someone who is committing idolatry. What is the idolatry that's involved here? The idolatry, I wonder if using Ernest Becker in his wonderful book, The Denial of Death, where he talks about what he calls transference heroics. And that is a way of finding an answer in this mysterious world, and with a sense somewhere of being bewildered about how to live one's life. He takes that as the condition of every man. To choose someone or some people and decide that they are the ones who solve my mystery. They are the ones who dispel the mystery. All I have to do is imitate them, is be like them, adore them, and then I've solved the mystery of how to live. And that is idolatry in a certain sense. That is the solution of idolatry. Freud calls it transference. It means transferring onto a particular, very limited human being who is hardly the ideal bearer of such an adoration, all the adoration and all the will to live a life, a larger life, a life that's attached to the largest ideals. I find a simple solution when I find another human being. Otto Rank, one of the earlier psychoanalysts, says this: personality is shaped and formed according to a vital need to please the other person whom we make our God. Right? That starts in childhood. Right? It's obviously an infantile desire, to please the parent, but it goes on throughout life. There is this sometimes really dysfunctional desire always to please someone we have chosen as our God. That's what Rashi means by, trying somewhere to imitate a master, to be with a master and to use that as the gauge of our way in the world. And the aim somewhere, Otto Rank says, being charitable, is to enlarge our being in some way. We think by imitating this person, this teacher, this charismatic figure, I will be enlarging my life. And then the question becomes, am I enlarging my life or am I constricting it? Either way, there is a sense of idolatry about this. And Becker quotes Albert Camus, talking about the fear of life, which is almost as strong as the fear of death with which we live, that is one of the basic conditions with which we live and with which we allow ourselves to be defeated in life. He quotes Camus, who says that we are alone without a God, without a master. When we are alone without a God and without a master, then the weight of days is dreadful. It's terrible to live like that. And so we must choose a master. That's our recourse. I think he's being ironic. God being out of style. There is that highly ironic tossed off line. Since God is out of style, then we are obliged to choose a human master. Otherwise, we are totally bewildered. And so Behar wants to say that that is a rather dubious transaction. That you will hero worship, right? You have hero. I used to be a great hero worshipper in my younger days, so I have a lot of sympathy for this. Partly because of a genuine desire to transcend oneself. Right? Transference in its nobler face. Buber actually has a sentence in which he talks about choosing such an object, such a person, as meaning to create a reality one needs in order to discover oneself. And there is that. One chooses sometimes a teacher, a rebbe, one adores him or her, and it has its downsides to it, definitely, right? There's much to say about this. The good side of it is that in adoring this teacher, one is in a way coming to understand what oneself wants to be. And at a certain point, one begins to see around the edges of the teacher. You begin to see that this is an idol, in a sense. This is not God. And one begins to look for the transcendent as it will be in some way achieved in oneself. One tries to go straight for the mystery and not use any props of other human beings meantime. So there is such a thing as the spell cast by persons, which is what Rashi is talking about. That is slavery. And our slave who refuses to go free is refusing to be a person in the world, in this case an Israelite in the world, who loves God rather than loving a master. And the two things are not exactly the same. It's not the same kind of love. One is the love of aspiration, and the other is the love that is fired to some extent by fear. So if we say that, then we can come back now to the Shmita. What is the Shmita? The way it's introduced in the book of Deuteronomy, right? It's introduced here very, very thoroughly in our Parsha, but it comes back again in the book of Deuteronomy. And I want to read a short passage here. It's in chapter 15. It's not on your page. It's chapter 15, verse 7. This is in the context of laws of not persecuting the debtor, of not being generous to the poor person who needs you. If you have a poor person in one of your brothers in one of your gates in your land, which God is giving you, the land that God is giving you, that's one of the situations that you will come across. He will be poor, and he will be your brother. You shall not ta'ametz et levavcha. You shall not clench your heart. Ta'ametz. It means to tense up your heart. Lo tikpotz et yadcha. It means almost the same. Tikpotz, again, shrink, hold tight your hand away from your brother, the poor man. That is, we're talking here again about a body sense. This is the body sense of you who is being addressed here, the master who is being addressed, that you should not refuse kindness. And what is it to refuse kindness? It is to clench, hold in tension, tense up different parts of your body, different parts of your psyche. But instead, what you should do is patoach tiftach et yadcha. You shall indeed open up wide doubled your hand, and you should help to free the poor man from his exigencies, and you should be careful. And what should you be careful of? Hishamer lecha, what should you watch out for? Lest you have in your heart something wicked. Davar im levavcha blia, which says, the seventh year is coming, and then your eye will look evilly at your brother. V'ra'a einecha, your brother, the poor man, and you won't give him what he needs because you'll think, I'm going to lose my money. The Shmita year is coming, and then all debts will be forgiven, and I don't want that, so I'm going to do that thing which one does, which the Torah is very physical and very, very material about describing. This is the material imagination, which is the basis of poetry. Instead of saying, be generous, don't be, right? There are words for generosity. Instead, it talks about body organs. There's the heart, and there is the hand, and there is the eye, how you look at another person. Is that glance in your eye going to be a stingy glance, a possessive glance, or is it going to be a generous glance, and so on? But it's really, in some sense, the phenomenology here is based on the body. Let your heart not be evil. Right? Don't be resentful when you give the poor man what he needs. Even if you do give him, don't give it in a stingy way, and then there will be blessing. Then God will bless you, because there will never be an end of poverty in your land. Right? Don't imagine that the problem will ever be solved. This is going to be a constant demand on you. That's why I'm commanding you again. Patoach tiftach. Open up. Release. Shamot, release your hand. That is the basic meaning of Shmita. That is the basic the basic concept of Shmita is letting go of what you are in danger of tensing, closing, right? Closing yourself within a mitzrayim, within a constriction, which leaves you in some way safer if you don't take the risk of opening up. And so the commandment here is open up and be careful that you don't close up. And this is in relation to debts, and it's in relation to letting the slave go free. And when it comes right down to it, it's really about not being resentful. Lo yera libcha, let your heart and your eye not look bad, feel bad about even doing the right thing. That is, that feeling of resentfulness. This is really hard. Shmita is, and that's really true, of course, it's part of it's characteristic of Shmita. It's constitutive of Shmita that it's hard. It's an emotionally difficult thing to do. And I want to go into that a little bit at this point. The slave who refuses to go free, just to leave that behind, he gets pierced in his ear as a sign of disgrace, that he has refused the excellence which was offered to him as one of Bnei Israel. He was offered as one of the Israelite people. He was offered him that excellence, and he has refused it. He has gone with this fantasy of a human master as being easier in some way. In some way, now the slave is a moral agent. And with this, then, we can move to the laws of the Jubilee. Have a look now at number 5. How does that move this situation on of having to let go, relax your organs, the organs that threaten always to close up against the opportunities and the difficult opportunities that are offered in the world? It's always a challenge. If I can hark back for a moment to something that comes into my mind now. Ramban has a passage in which he talks about how the land shouldn't be sold into perpetuity. That cannot be. And then the result is that comes the Jubilee year, at least every 50th year, everything returns to status quo. The land that you have bought goes back to its original owner, and so does money, and so do slaves. Slaves are freed, and so on. And Ramban addresses the issue, and I'm just going to touch on this. It's fascinating. He says, clearly it's the buyer of the land who is being exhorted to let go of the land. right? Especially in the Jubilee year. Yeah. In the Jubilee year. That's a difficult experience. It's emotionally difficult. You've bought it and you got used to it. It's yours. You think of it as yours. And suddenly something happens, the Jubilee year comes, and tries to ease you in some way away from that fixed, rigid position of it's mine. Right. Sheli. It's not yours, it's mine. God says, Ki li haaretz, mine is the land, mine are the slaves. Ki li atem avadim lefanai, ger v'toshav atem imadi, ki li haaretz. Yes, right at the end of the parsha. God says li in opposition to that primal human instinct to say, no, it's mine. It's mine, I'm used to it, I bought it. And Ramban adds to this and says this is difficult not just for the person who has bought the land, it's also difficult for the person who sold the land to you. Right. And here again we have a reversal of focus. We might have thought that the person who's bought the land is the wealthy person, and we're interested somewhere in getting him to be charitable and humane and give back the land to the poor person who was forced to sell it. But Ramban says it's equally difficult for the one who sold it, who sold the land. First of all, it's actually forbidden. But even beyond that, it's a very difficult situation. And he also has to be in some way persuaded to let go of a fixed idea. And the fixed idea with which he may have colluded at the time of the sale, he may have colluded with the buyer to make the buyer feel that he could pay a higher price because after all he's getting it forever. So there is that sense of a collusion between buyer and seller that has to do with the ways of trade in this world. And God comes now and says, no, when it comes right down to it, you are in the margins and I am at the center of this story. Your sense of possessiveness has in some way to liquefy. You have to soften. You have to relax about it. Because the land is mine and the slaves are mine. But not in that sense of possessiveness. It's as if that sense of things is really means simply that there is no master. There is a hefkerut, things have been left free now. There is no master. Have a look at the Sefer HaChinuch. Number 5. Yes. Why does the shofar have to be blown on Yom Kippur when the slaves really go free? And so the Sefer HaChinuch, which lists all the commandments and then gives us the shorshei HaMitzvah, the root concept of the commandment, says this: we blow the shofar because it is well known that the shofar has an orer effect. It's an alarm clock. It's a kind of sharp stimulus that wakes you up from sleep, that wakes you up from the stupor of the way things are, the way things simply are. As you find that a shofar is blown to wake people up, whether for peace or for war. In other words, it doesn't have an ethical status, the shofar in itself. It could be for good things, it could be for bad things, but the shofar is something that is necessary to wake you from that stupor, which is the root of stupidity. George Eliot likes to play with that pun. It's not a pun, it's the actual root of the word. She just is very close to the root. Stupidity is a kind of moral and existential stupidity that just goes along half asleep. And comes the shofar actually to help wake up both the master and the slave. That's what he wants to emphasize. From the dream, from the sleep of being in this situation of slavery, in which one loves one's master, right? This is kashem od be'enei adonav. It's hard for the master to let go of this, and it's also hard for the slave. Now that's where the Sefer HaChinuch pushes again into this unexpected shift of focus. Now we're not just saying, oh, yes, of course the slave wants to go free. No, the slave may not want to go free, because the slave too is involved in a kind of enchantment, in a kind of spell, which has to do with the nature of power in this world, with the nature of capitalism, if you will, with the nature of safety and danger. And so for the servant as well, it may be that he needs an awakening in order to leave, and the awakening he gets is the shofar, which reminds him that this is a movement that everyone else throughout the country is going through, and that helps you to put up with your own individual case. The trouble of many, tzarat rabim nechama, he quotes there towards the end. If many people have the same problem, then that's a bit of a comfort. And so the idea then would be going free for the slave is a tzara. That is, it's a break of a habit, but it's the break of a kind of instinct, of a fantasy. And the shofar comes roughly to break you up from that and to create a situation of what's called in the Torah, dror. Ukaratem dror. You shall proclaim freedom. Dror. Now, it's a difficult word to know exactly what it means, but it means somewhere, as Rashi says. Let me see if we have it here. Number 6. No, we're not there yet. No. But it's a state of freedom, but Rashi says it's the freedom to dror, daled resh, to live wherever you like. You don't have to live in the regulated place, your place in the world, which is being a slave to a master and adoring that master who has become your God, whom you have created somehow as your God. And the need, and also free to trade wherever and however you want. That's what it means to be dror in a situation of trade. Suddenly, trade becomes trade and living where you like become like a situation of disorder. You have, in a way, lost the organization, the structure, the order of your life, where you know where you are and what belongs to you, which is basically nothing. And that, in a way, offers a kind of relief. You know that you are nothing. If you can't be everything, then you might as well be nothing. Whereas suddenly there is this other reality in which, well, there is a large span between everything and nothing. One midrashic detail here is very eloquent. How does the slave spend the 10 days from the beginning of the year of Jubilee, Rosh Hashanah, till the 10th day, Yom Kippur, when he goes free? Does he suddenly go free on the 10th day? No. What happens during those 10 days is that he lives freely in his master's house. He has the status of a free man. He lives, the idea is in some way to practice this difficult alternative freedom, alternative discipline of freedom. And he sits with a crown on his head, says the midrash. It's the Gemara, I think it's the Gemara in Rosh Hashanah, says that somewhere he sits at a kind of Saturnalia. He sits with a crown on his head, acting master, which is a kind of almost violent and grotesque reversal of roles. Suddenly there he is, milking his new situation for everything that it's worth. But perhaps what he's really doing is, in some way, he's undergoing a kind of shock therapy himself. He's not just administering shock therapy to his master in a kind of vengeful moment, but he is trying to get himself used to a difficult idea. And there's almost a kind of something apocalyptic about it. This is this is the end of the known world, this freedom, which is called dror here, and which is called Shmita, which means letting go, letting loose everything that you possessed up to that point, a situation in which you were possessed by that situation, and then leaving the lands, not thinking of the slave anymore, but of the master of the land, someone who owns land, suddenly moves into an unregulated situation in which the land rests. But what does that rest mean? That letting go, Shmita, that relinquishing of the hold on the land. Another way of putting it might be a kind of, again, demystifying of the idea, might be to say that you are now going to neglect the land. It's an act of outrageous negligence. The land is now going to fall into neglect. There is no longer going to be anyone dealing with it, looking for profit, taking things from the field into the house, and from the house into the market, right? That whole, I don't know if I should call it a capitalist system or a system of trading simply, in which you look to improve your resources, that you have resources and you exchange them in order to be able to improve your standard of living. And the resources are now, what situation are they in now? Now you may eat from the field, the rest of the land. See Rashi in number 6. V'hayita Shabbat haaretz lachem leochla. The rest of the land will be for you for food. In other words, you don't have to starve. You can use the field, the land, to feed yourself. And so Rashi makes this clear. And he puts it like this: even though I have forbidden all those fruits for you, all that produce of the land, you are no longer the master of the land. I haven't forbidden your eating of it or enjoying it in any way that is good for you immediately. Not trading, not exchanging for other things, but just enjoying what is out there in the field. The only thing is, the red line is, shelo tinhog bahem keval habayit. You shouldn't treat these products of the field as if you own them, as if they're yours. You are the Baal Habayit. You are the exclusive owner. Now, it's that sense of power, of being the exclusive owner of one's possessions, of one's lands, of one's estates, that now has to be broken. Somewhere a habit, right, a masterful habit has to be broken. Everyone can eat of the fruit of the land just like you. Right, you and your hired servant and your all the list that follows there of people who are subsidiary to you, subservient to you. Suddenly you're all on equal terms. You can all go and eat, but you have no special rights. I'm not the Balabait. Now that expression, to be the Balabait, has enormous instinctual power. Everyone wants somewhere to lay claim to that, which means more than just to ownership. It means I'm in charge here. It's Barashut. I have power in this area. This is an area where I really can see, what I control around me. And it may be not only fields and physical things, materialistic things, maybe in general a sense of masterfulness over other people, and perhaps even over oneself. In a certain sense. The only master is God, and God can't be seen. Right? God is not material. And when you say that it is God, that in some way you're saying you're left to try to find out what is God in the world. What is it that God wants of you? You may not trade, exchange. What does that mean in the end? That means that the land has to be left to rot, really. It's really an offensive idea. Suddenly, when the land is resting, it becomes holy, right? The expression of holiness is used. It becomes holy by inertia, by no one actually doing anything. And there's something very difficult about that idea. You just have to let it be. That's the commandment. To let it be and not do the usual fruitful things that you do in order to create something out of your resources. The irony is, and the paradox is, that this cannot, of course, be a situation that is prolonged very long. A year is a very long time for such a situation of negligence, of letting things grow wild and grow rank, back to a state of nature. It's not an idealized state at all. It's not, Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden. It's Adam and Eve, in this world, seeing things wasted, seeing resources go to waste. And I want to emphasize the darker side of this. That's what it means not to be able to trade. And the paradox and the irony of all this is that in general, for 6 years out of 7, for 6 days out of 7, it is perhaps even a commandment to trade and to work. Right? It says, Sheshet yamim ta'avod, 6 days you shall work, and on the 7th day you shall rest, okay, for God. Question is that you shall work, does it mean simply, as we tend to read it, you may work, right? Work is okay. It's certainly allowed. Or does it mean more than that? Does it mean actually that you must be engaged in work? And there is a view that goes in that direction. Sheshet yamim ta'avod is actually a mitzvah of its own. And then we have a kind of dialectic. There is a commandment to work, and then 1 day in 7, lishbot, Shabbat, to desist. That means let go. Don't do anything. Let things be. You can't do anything more. And that psychic movement, right, it's a fundamental psychic movement, which creates a kind of energy void, right? The sense of, so what do I do with my energy? Well, the answer that's given is La Hashem. Turn your energy towards God. But in every way that we're familiar with, it was commanded for 6 days to actually work. Now, if that's the case, that work is a commandment for those 6 days, then perhaps that explains why it is, and I have a couple of examples here, why it is allowed to set sail, for instance, on a ship on Erev Shabbat, even if it means that you will be sailing on Shabbat, if you are going on business. If you are going on business, schora, trading, it's a commandment to do that. So that becomes a kind of positive value, and therefore you are allowed to set sail. To be in a situation of batala is to be in a situation of sort of emptiness, voidness, negligence, neglect. It's a negative word. Yeah. But the word shmita, to rest, is also a negative word. And we find both words used of the Shemita year and of the Yovel year as positives. To be in some way empty, void, perhaps receptive, even if it means a kind of destructiveness, right? The destructiveness, right? It's the waste of good things in the world no longer are your concern. And so in order to do that, you need a kind of arousal, you need a shofar to arouse you to this. In general, we have a very different way of looking at the balance of things. It's a matter of the figure and the ground. In general, our general reality in the social and material and business world is that busy is good. It's good to be busy. It's healthy to be busy. And in fact, in the Talmud, Rabbi Yoshia says, "Gdola melacha shemechamemet et baaleha." Et oseha. Great is work which heats up those who do it. In other words, you know what it is. It's a good thing to work. Everyone knows the healthiness of being actively engaged in something, physically, mentally, emotionally. It warms you up. It gives you a feeling of being alive. And that feeling of being alive, it's great. It's very much approved of. And on the contrary, the Beit Din, it's a strange law, is allowed to divorce a couple if the husband refuses to let his wife work. Isn't that an interesting one? If the Beit Din refuses to let his wife work and leaves her empty-handed, doing nothing, sitting around all day, that is an unhealthy situation. That is a situation in which mental health is endangered. That's the understanding of the sages. And that marriage shouldn't last. That's not a situation for a human being. So great is the belief in the importance of work. And in exactly the same breath, so great is the importance of the seventh day of batala and shvita and emptiness and unemployment. Right? Kenneth Burke, a philosopher, points out that in Greek there is a similar paradox, that the word skoladzine in Greek means to occupy one's leisure. That is, there is a value in being at leisure. That's called skoladzine, if you occupy that time in a good way, in a positive way. So it's a kind of affirmation here. But what does it really mean? It's good to be unemployed, whereas the word for being employed is a negative, askolain, right? To be not in a situation of leisure. Now that is, again, it's the figure in the ground. Normally we tend to think that the figure, the thing in front, is to work. Yeah, it's a good thing to work. And then, you know, perhaps sometimes it's good not to work. But here, there is suddenly again that switch. And what you have here now suddenly is that in Greek culture, perhaps the slavery culture that accounts for it, we're not talking about slaves here, we're talking about those who have the resources financially and culturally to make good use of their leisure. That's the positive state. And you have a similar idea in the language of Chazal when they say that every city should have 10 batlanim, 10 people who do nothing, who are unemployed, right? Who learn in kollel, right? This is the Haredi. The Haredim have taken this very seriously. Batlanim is a positive word. Now, without adopting the sociology of the Haredim, I think one needs to try to understand the concept here. I want to say the concept has something to do with this. Something that Keats says, the poet John Keats. He says, there is a value, and it's a very high value, which is the value of the artist, and it's the value of a person who's achieved a certain ripeness in intellect, that he's capable of what he calls diligent indolence. Diligent indolence. To be indolent, to be passive, not to be rushing around doing things, to be receptive in some way, and to be very busy while you're doing nothing. Diligent indolence, on the watch all the time, or as the Sfatimet would put it, with one's ears bent for what is going to come up next. What is the next thing I'm going to work on? And that receptive void is the basis of creativity. It's the basis of study and reflection. And even the idea of waste comes up, right? That, what I call that demystified idea, that makes us feel it's not such a positive state, to be doing nothing, to be the flower rather than the bee, Keats says, the busy bee who's always visiting all the flowers, right? We tend to put him at the center, but perhaps we should value and validate the flower who waits in passivity for the next thing that has to happen. And so in Keats, in that passage in Keats, it's in one of Keats's letters, he actually talks about wasting time. There is one thing you waste certainly when you are in this kind of receptive state, and that is time. So perhaps we shouldn't be too romantic and too idealizing about the idea of Shabbat and Shemita and Yovel and creative states of this kind. Keats and others may call such a state reverie. It's a very beautiful word, to be in a state of dream in which things can get born, new things can get born, and meantime you are not doing anything, you're unemployed. But at the same time, there is a sense of waste. So much is going to waste that in some way I have an itch to be busy with. And the shofar comes at least once every 50 years to wake us up from that world of sensibility, from that world of things. As Gaston Bachelard puts it, we talked about him last week, the philosopher who talks about things, the world of things, the order of things, which is the world of the week and the world of the 49 years and the 7 years, the 6 years. That's the world of things, and then there is the world of intimacy, the intimate order. Right? And that, right, I wanted to say that the world of things defeats the sense of intimacy with all things. Right? Because somewhere there we are trying to shape and limit and structure everything to be for certain narrow purposes, and we are losing, we are covering up, we are obscuring then what could be uncovered, which is the ground of things that is dazzlingly bright. Right? We mentioned that last week, that there is something else, another state of being that comes when you sacrifice. It is a sacrifice, all that engagement with things, and allow them in some way to recede into darkness, somewhere. That is not where the light is now. And the light now is on that movement of relinquishing, of letting go, of giving a coal to the fire and becoming one with the coal and the fire and everything in the world, right? The soundless murmuring of a river, that sense of intimacy with the whole of being, which has something to do with the divine. But it's not an easy matter. It's not an easy project, the project of Shmita. Have a look at Rabbeinu Bechaya on your page. It's the next source. Bechaya, number 7. Describing again what happens when you don't work the vines that you own. You don't work them and you don't deal with them at all. This state of things is called being a Nazir. That is, somehow you've put it apart from you. What is that mental, that emotional movement? You are detaching it from you. It's not mine anymore. Eino shalo, kedavar she'eino shalo. Like a Nazir who doesn't trim his hair. He's got hair growing out of his head, but he doesn't make it orderly and nice and aesthetic and interfere with it and structure it and so on and court a woman by looking beautiful and all the rest of it. All the rest of the thinginess of this world. That means he is no longer the master, Adon. And the whole purpose of the 7th year, says Rabbeinu Bechaya, who has strong mystical tendencies, is to achieve that state of what he calls then being chareva. The land becomes chareva ubetela, destroyed and void. That is, he doesn't try to obscure the dark side of this, the side that is very difficult. To give up mastership and meaning and the imposition of oneself on the world for the good, which is a positive mitzvah for 6 days, and to give up on that and allow a sense of batala, which becomes the ground of all deep being, deep creativity. That state of being, that if one fails to achieve that, the punishment is exile. If one sins that is, one doesn't fulfill this mitzvah of Shmita, of Shabbat, of all the different kinds of Shabbat, different variations of Shabbat that there are, the 7th year, the 49th year, the 50th year, and so on. If one doesn't keep these things, the punishment is exile. And what is exile, after all, if not a kind of major and traumatic Shabbat? That the land is now left to run rank, to run wild. And in this situation of galut of this kind, what has failed to happen is the essential creativity, the deep creativity of having a kind of immunization every week, every 7 years, every 50 years, a kind of immunization against that tragic possibility of losing oneself entirely, right? Which is the end of the slippery slope in the midrash that we started with. And then becomes the story of the 7 times 70 years of exile that historically become a fact because of failure to observe these minimal experiences of neglect, destruction, loss of masterfulness, and in which offer rewards that perhaps are unpredictable. Rabbeinu Bechaya goes on to say, it's not in the passage that you have on your page, this experience of owning one's field only in the same way as everyone else does, that is, it's open to everyone, and one has no special relationship with that. That is a situation in which one's field, in the end, if one is exiled, is completely lost to one, as is one's whole land. V'hayita artzachem shmama. What will happen at that time? All right, here you have. This is in next week's Parsha, and this is describing, in fact, what's called the tochacha, the rebuke about the terrible penalty for failing to keep this 1 in 7 moment of experience. If you fail to keep it, your whole land will be shmama. And what does shmama mean? It isn't just that it will fall into neglect and into kind of destructive, it could fall into non-being, but it's something that will happen to you, because you will not quickly get back to it. This exile will not be brief. It will pay in full for all those mini exiles from the world that you failed to observe. And the result will be that the cities will be ruined, and that doesn't mean, it's not an objective description of the cities, although it may well be that too. But what the Torah is saying, according to Rashi, is much more to do with you and your emotional state, your body state. What will happen to you? Nirot lachem charivot. That your cities and your fields will seem to you ruined. Why? Because when a person is exiled from his home and from his vineyard and from his city, in the end, but he knows that he is due to return finally, then it's as if these things are not really destroyed. But if he is exiled and he has no hope of return, and that's the nature of Galut, one doesn't know how long one's being exiled for. It's the endless nature of exile, of that kind of formless, shapeless way of being, in which there are no controls at all of the kind we like. The nature of that is that oneself, one's psychic state, then enters into a state of devastation. I can't in any way project hope when I think of my home, because I have no hope of returning, and in some way then I enter myself into a state of destruction. So Shmita is a kind of immunization against that terrible state, which is described in the Torah in terrible ways. One of the most terrible descriptions, as you may remember, is that the sound, you will hear the sound of your enemies like the sound of a driven leaf. Right? Like the sound of a driven, ka'alei. And the description there has to do with a state of hallucination, a state of mental disorder, emotional disorder, a sense in which Rashi says, I don't think we have this on the page, talks about the driven leaf. He's very material about it. He imagines it. What will it sound like? Like one leaf rustling against another. So you get that rustling sound in your ear, that hollow sound, or like a door, the sound it makes when it sort of bangs against a doorpost. So that sense of hollowness and emptiness, hollow sounds that one is subject to in a state of depression, in a state of alienation from oneself. Alienation means madness. That is, and I'm pushing the idea one radical stage further, that the problem, the sin against Shmita, the desire not to fulfill the laws of Shmita, we could say have to do with a kind of compulsive sanity. That of course it's a sane thing to do. Right? My mental health is expressed in my working the land and in my exchanging the fruits of the land and making things better for myself and for everyone around one. It's not so good for the poor when the land is left in neglect. Right? So all kinds of rationality and sanity are in favor, let me say, are against keeping the laws of Shmita, right? If I can put it provocatively like that. But the cost of failing to go a little bit mad for one day or 1 year, letting things go, unclenching, opening, the cost of that is the real experience of that kind of madness, where suddenly one has no control at all, endlessly, right? Somewhere there's a sense in which one fails now to play any kind of role in the world of things, to which one might have returned otherwise after the 1 day mad interval, with an increased sense of depth and sensibility and deep purpose in the world of things. That is, it's the dialectic between the two worlds, the world of things and the intimate world, that one will return after the 7th year to the ordinary world. After Shabbat, one goes back to creating things and producing things and tending to things, right? But one comes back with something of an altered sensibility comes from what I'm calling the madness, the letting go-ness of Shabbat. Draw the ultimate liberty of the 50th year. God warns the people through Jeremiah, through the prophet Jeremiah, that if you fail to keep your promise, to keep the law of Shmita, the people enter into a covenant actually with God. They promise by the name of God to keep the laws of Shmita again, and Nebuchadnezzar releases them from the siege. Everything goes well for them, and then as soon as they are free of the siege, they clamp down again with the laws of Shmita. And it's at that point that God says very angrily through Jeremiah, you now can proclaim a real freedom. Now it will be a freedom, not, right? It won't be the 50th year. You failed to keep that. It will be a freedom from me as your sole protector, me as that presence in the world that you know only when you are in contact with me or when you have proclaimed absence from me. You have refused to proclaim yourselves as part of that attachment in the world. Have a look now at, we are moving towards the end. One of the last things I want to look at now is the Sfat Emet. The Sfat Emet is a longish passage. I just want to try to pull out the essential threads. What is Shmita? Why is Shmita mentioned in the same breath as Har Sinai? That's the beginning of the Parsha. It was given at Mount Sinai. And there is a quotation, "Bless God, O you, his angels." Not all his angels, says the Sfat Emet, shall bless God. There are lower angels who haven't got the strength to fulfill God's commandments. But those among you who are higher angels are Giburei Koach. You are full of a strength, a certain strength. You are mighty of strength. And what does the midrash, what does the Talmud say, is the focus of that particular strength? That translates as those who keep the laws of Shmita. Osei dvaro, ze dvar Shmita. It takes an extraordinary and a singular strength to do that. And it was that strength that helps the people to receive Torah to start with. What did they have to do in order to get to Har Sinai? They had to go through Midbar. It's the Midbar experience, which is like the Shmita experience in being Eretz Lo Zru'ah. Right? And Jeremiah will remember it for the people later, yes. He will say, Zacharti lach chesed ne'urayich. I remember that you were Hasidim once when you were young. Yes, you had that ability to live on potential, to live on aspiration, to go through a desert, to go through a howling waste and a wilderness, which has its terrors too. Right? There are sources we won't be able to get to today. To be able to go through that nothingness and that letting go-ness. Right? Because you went through a midbar, you received Torah. And ever since then, it's not everyone who can receive Torah, who can actually be there for Torah and for the divine in the world. Who is it? It's only someone who is mevatel kol haolam hazeh, who has the energy, the koach, at least for certain time periods, to dismiss, to levatel, right? To let go of this whole world, all of this world meaning the world of things, the world of productivity, the world of progress, where I want to see results for what I do. That world, if you haven't the ability to let go of that, then you cannot receive Torah. And what will it take then for the future? He says, it will be people of very particular kind of strength, and that kind of strength is assisted by the occasional, every now and then, there will be a moment in time when we will go back to the midbar. Such a moment in time is Shabbat, is Shmita, is the Yovel. That is, don't over-romanticize Shabbat. Shabbat has about it a midbar. Tohu yilel yeshimon. The howling wastes, the jackals and ostriches that Rashi understands. There are all kinds of terrifying noises in the midbar. But you, those who are of strength, can endure that and wait for the voice of God. Wait to hear that voice of God, right? And not get enslaved by simply doing things. All right, I'll just do what I have to do. But somewhere being open to that potential voice, that voice of, in a way, no, I'm not going to talk about that. He ends up by saying, Kamochen b'shanat Shmita, that is mamash. He says that the year, the Shmita year, is exactly, literally, it fulfills, you went after me in an unsown land. Right? The Eretz lo zruah. Right? You went after me in the wilderness. Yeah? This was the love of your youth, your ability to engage with the unsown land. That was the midbar, and that is Shmita. That's your opportunity to cue in again periodically to that. And with this, I want to look at the last two sources. Liquidei Maharan. We may be 5 minutes overdue, if you will forgive me. Liquidei Maharan, number 11. This is Rabbi Nachman, 18th century, saying something quite unexpected. He's talking about tzedakah, giving charity. The mitzvah of giving charity. And he quotes a verse from the book of Kings about the prophet Elijah, to whom God says, I have commanded the ravens to sustain you, to bring you food. And the ravens do indeed bring him food in the desert. He has fled to the desert from the vengeful king, Achav. And he says, this is all about charity. You know, when the Rabbi Nachman says this is all about zebechinat, he really is in a world of associations. He says, now we have to free associate. You may not see the connection right away. This is about charity. Why? And I'll paraphrase now. Because the beginning of the act of charity, of giving to another generously and uncalculatingly, is always to break a certain cruelty. It's a very difficult thing to do. It's always hard, right, to begin to give in this way, this letting go, because it always implies a kind of breakdown of what he calls cruelty, achzariyut, and transforming cruelty into rachmanut, into compassion. And that is the essence of the mitzvah of charity. Someone who is naturally compassionate, he says. Right? It sounds really counterintuitive. If you just are, that's how you are. You just tend to give. Whenever someone asks, you just give by nature. And that's why he gives in this case. That's not avodah. That isn't an act of piety. That has nothing to do with God. You're just doing what comes naturally. There are certain animals also who are naturally pious and they feed their young and so on. Maybe that's why he attaches this to the ravens, who perhaps are not so generous about bringing food. And so it's something about even God makes it that the ravens change their natural cruelty and they will come and feed you. So you, Eliyahu, don't be cruel, don't be heartless when you have to deal with society again, when you come back from the midbar and you have to deal with the idolatrous king. You know, lay off a little bit. But when it comes to the general idea of charity, the idea here, I want to finish with this. The idea of charity here is a very profound one. You may think, I will give charity, as we saw in that passage in Deuteronomy, I will give charity to someone whom I can help out of the pit of poverty. I will give him money if it turns out to be a productive investment. I will give him the wherewithal to redeem himself. I will bring redemption of the world, bring about redemption. But that passage in Devarim said there will always be poor among you. In which case, giving tzedakah to the poor is in a way losing your money in the pit. You throw your money, the poor person is there in front of you. There is the presence of someone who is irredeemably poor. He is not going to start being a productive member of society. Let's take a case like that. Are you going to clench up? Then there's a natural, normal, I would say, reaction of, it's not going to do me any good, it's not going to do the world any good, and it's not going to do him any good to give him money. That way of being that has to do with a certain kind of grim sanity. It's a kind of the ethic of productivity. That rules, the ethic of things. Don't be like that. Relax. Let go of all that tension. Right. You give him money because there he is destitute. That's all you have to know. He hasn't got and you have. And so you give, and that puts you in touch with God. It's as simple as that, because it's God who commands this. Ki anochi mitzavecha patoach tiftach. You shall indeed open, like a birth. Right? It's like an instruction, Rabbi Nachman says. It's like an instruction to the birthing woman. The idea is not to clench up, but to let go, so that something new may be born. And what is born is the compassionate self. The compassionate self is not the natural self in that sense. It has to overcome something that I'll call impoverishment. And let's have a look by way of finishing, today and our course, our whole series. If you have a look at number 12 on your page, this is a passage from an essay by Louise Gluck, the Nobel Prize winner, the poet and essayist, in an essay called Impoverishment. And let's read it together and close with this. She's describing, may I give some background? She's describing a year after she graduated from college in which everything went dead in her. She could find no inspiration. She didn't write a single poem. She tried to be employed. She tried to have work so that she would be busy and would write in the intervening time. She thought that might get her creative juices going, but nothing happened. And it was the most terribly difficult time. It was a time of being in the desert. And then after that, suddenly, after a 2-year gap in which nothing was produced, nothing came out, suddenly she wrote as she never had before. Language came to her in a different way. Realize then, she says, and she's addressing college students who are graduating, graduation address. Realize then that impoverishment is also a teacher, unique in its capacity to renew, and that its yield, when it ends, is a passionate openness which in turn reinvests the world with meaning. An intensity of awareness is impoverishment's aftermath and blessing. What succeeds temporary darkness, what succeeds the void, tohu, or the desert, midbar, is not the primary gift of the world. The primary gift of the world is the world of things, of the many, many things and the things you can do with them. But the essential secondary gift of knowledge, a sense of the significance of the original gift, the scale of our privilege. She's talking about Shmita. She's talking about Shabbat. It's very clear to me. Even some of the terms she uses, and God will bless you. Right? God will bless you if you open. If you open yourself to the nothingness. If you open yourself to the letting go. And don't try to skirt the despair. She goes on to say, don't be shrewd about it. And while you're going through it, you say, well, I hope and I'm sure in the end it'll be good. And so I won't feel the despair of what I'm going through now. She says, no, that's not the way to do it. The way to do it is a kind of rawness. You feel how hard it is, right? Naturally, everything in you resists it, but you overcome that resistance. It's that secondary movement, right, that Rabbi Nachman was talking about. You're not born compassionate. That's not the important compassion. The important compassion is the one that is born of letting go of cruelty, of letting go of a natural, in a way, innate human cruelty, which comes of living in the productive world, yeah, and finding a way, a kind of release from that, almost a kind of homeopathic release from that, by consuming just a little bit of that void during Shabbat, all the Shabbatot, and then realizing the blessing of Shabbat and the blessing of the Shmita, which consists of a kind of secondary level of knowledge, that now one knows something about the whole story, about the productivity and about the intimacy and about the nothingness and about the availability to what comes next. Thank you very much for listening, especially over time. And let me thank you all together for your unknown presence. I have been aspiring towards you for the last couple of months. And those of you who have written to me have been very helpful to me in that way. But meantime, I wish you much productivity and much ability to achieve deep creativity in your own lives.